opinions do not represent the official views of Stanford University or any of its associated divisions. Welcome. I'm here today with my very dear friend, Stefan. Stefan is the current president of Stanford in Government, which is the leading public service organization on campus. Stefan and I are here today to talk about student activism and public service on college campuses, which feels especially relevant today in light of the Ferguson protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, calls for divestment from companies operating in the West Bank, talks about sexual assault. It seems to be almost a renaissance for student activism on campus. We want to discuss the logistics of that. What does it imply for our generation as future leaders, as future politicians, etc. Recently on the Stanford campus, there was a group of students as part of the Silicon Valley Shutdown organization that stopped traffic on the San Mateo Bridge to raise awareness on MLK Day about the Black Lives Matter cause. This disruptive protesting is meant obviously to provoke people, to get them to really confront issues head on. Is it effective? Like, what change is sparked by disruptive acts such as shutting down the San Mateo Bridge?
There's not necessarily a tangible or actionable ask from these protests. They're not necessarily saying, I want these 3 pieces of legislation and these 2 laws changed regarding the treatment of African Americans in the United States. It's broader discontent, and it's an urge for disruption to change not just politics but social norms, and to broadly reconsider why society works the way it does. And a broad-based social movement is very effective when it brings coalitions together, a variety of different backgrounds, who all feel the same oppression and exploitation, or allies who might not necessarily ever be able to understand what that oppression feels like, but nonetheless understand that there's injustice in the society through one mechanism or another. One of the more renowned social movements would be the 1960s, would be the Civil Rights Movement, which was obviously successful in terms of its policy change, and also in terms of changing social norms and changing attitudes broadly in America. I would say that in the Ferguson protests, what you're trying to echo is something similar, bringing a lot of people together around this common discontent about policing, common discontent about racial attitudes in this country.
Critics of this movement that I've read tend to say this is a two-sided issue. There is increased police awareness and targeting of African American populations, but in turn there is also increased rates of crime and increased targeting of police officers and crime against police officers on behalf of African Americans. Focusing protests and focusing this activism on only reforming the police system perhaps ignores some comprehensive policy changes that need to be made to make adjustments within these communities to reduce the rates of crime.
I don't necessarily subscribe to that view.
Okay.
But I would say it is definitely a complex and kind of deeply structural issue, one that I would say goes back to the Reagan administration and this notion of broken windows policing, this idea that you should try to fix the broken windows before they lead to more serious problems. And what this ultimately resulted in the early 1980s was trying to criminalize more petty acts. And so things like shoplifting or possession of marijuana could have quite hefty charges.
Right.
But this was applied with a very uneven lens and continues to be applied in kind of an uneven way, and has ultimately resulted in kind of the targeting of African American males in particular. You get a relationship of oppressed and oppressor as opposed to law enforcement aiming to serve and protect, which is what police are supposed to do and what I honestly believe is their intent.
How do we get police officers to use less violence against these communities in particular when perhaps they feel like their lives are threatened?
I think they absolutely do feel like their lives are threatened. And so I think there are a few possible alternatives. One is getting police of the same background, same race as the communities in which they serve. That's actually shown statistically to actually greatly improve relations. Community policing empirically has also done a tremendous job of changing this framework. If you're in a squad car, it's not as effective as actually walking the streets of the neighborhoods you patrol. So developing interpersonal trust is something, it's not something that's easy. It's not something that can just happen overnight. But repeated interactions showing that these law enforcement officials are actually here to protect and serve is very important.
Bringing up the issue of divestment that's reared its head again this year on our campus, there was a student in my house in Slav who today was like, oh, I don't really understand what this divestment thing is. Like, what are these 2 sides? The really frustrating thing to me about the issue of divestment is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is such a gray issue. Occupation of the West Bank, there are moral qualms with that. Hamas operations out of Gaza and out of Palestinian-supported factions, there's a huge problem with that. The issue is very obviously not as black and white as should we vote yes or no for one side.
I agree completely that there's no cut and dry way to look at any of these issues. Activism, however jarring, can certainly serve the important role of raising perspectives and drawing.
But it raises perspectives on behalf of the loudest side. The student in my house today, whose opinion on the subject is obviously quite malleable, if he hears one side screaming loudly about the cause, they are led to believe that one side. That that polarization of the issue, is that going to lead to solutions? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you ultimately have to do is call for a great, not only self-examination, but issue examination. This involves a lot of research. This involves taking a lot of time.
Right.
And here on this campus, people are really busy, and sometimes people are not the most involved when it comes to civic engagement.
Right.
It's up to all of us to take that time to educate ourselves about the issue, not necessarily listen to who's loudest, or not necessarily listen to who has the flashiest poster or campaign or whatever it is, but to actually think about, what do I believe, and why do I believe what I believe? Is it because someone told me, or is it because I've done my own research? Is it because I've looked into all sides of the issue? That involves being a greater citizen.
People can go on Facebook and they can see on their newsfeed 30 people writing their one-off opinions about an issue and go on a liking spree and consider themselves to be civically engaged. At what point is this armchair activism, this sitting in your swivel chair at home on Facebook, liking something, pouring a bucket of ice over your head, diluting our perception of what it means to be a public servant, to be an activist?
I think it can do a tremendous amount of damage. I would start, though, by noting that social media, certainly Facebook, helped launch a lot of amazing protests in Tahrir Square in Egypt. It can certainly galvanize public opinion, right? So I think that if you are looking for social media as a role to raise consciousness, again, I think it can do a good job of that, much like activism can. But I think it's ultimately, when it comes to a rigorous and intensive examination of the issues at hand, I think there's really no substitute for taking the time to engage all sides. And then the question becomes less of what do we believe in and who, is someone evil? And the question becomes more of a question of process and logistics. What works? And then we can actually start to measure things. We can start to say, okay, we agree that we want to reduce inequality, for example. Now let's figure out the best way to do that. I don't believe that conservatives and liberals have as much difference as it might appear on the surface.
Much of it's politics.
Much of it's politics, and much of its differences in that process. But if we can agree on those underpinnings and those fundamentals, then I think we've really advanced progress.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Stefan, what are suggestions for students who perhaps are hard science majors and these issues don't weigh on them heavily in their studies, yet they're feeling this social pressure to become involved? What is the best way to become involved in activist process in this public service?
If you're studying nanotechnology policy is a very important field. If you're a computer scientist, cybersecurity is a burgeoning issue. You can find the civic component to your study anywhere. If there's one piece of advice, generally, I would say engage all sides of an issue. Go to events with speakers with whom you agree and with whom you disagree. Engage with people in dialogue with whom you have different political subscriptions.
Definitely. Stefan, I'm so glad you were here to have this conversation with me. As always, everyone, please comment, subscribe, get involved in this conversation, not only with us here on our social media channel, but with your communities, in your dorm, with your family. It's really important, obviously, to engage in these issues. It's the only way we can lead to greater understanding and get rid of these political barriers that prevent us from really getting stuff done. Until next time.
Thanks.
See ya.